Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center for Recovery, and I'm really excited to be here today with Nkem Ndefo. She has something called Lumos Transforms, and she works with resilience and trauma. So I'm going to keep my introduction to that, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself and welcome to the summit.
Thank you so much for having me. I have a pretty diverse background, and I think if I would say the theme of my professional career is transformation and looking for places, methods, frameworks that help people, communities, organizations do transformation, change. And sometimes that's healing work. Often it is healing work, but there's other kinds of change that's possible. And so towards the end goal of less suffering, more justice, more compassion, the kind of world we want to live in. So I've done that in various different contexts, with various different approaches. And even now, I have a pretty broad, Lumos, we work pretty broadly with lots of different types of folks in, again, different contexts, but all around how do we do change well.
So if you were to give us kind of a map of the journey so far for you, what got you interested in doing this kind of work, and what is it? And I'd also like to get into what is it that Lumos does. It's fascinating to read your website. There's a lot of different arenas that you work in.
And actually, our website is in the process of being updated because it's actually probably 2 years behind what we're doing now, or a year and a half. Like, things change.
Yeah.
I actually did very early on worked with people using needle injectable drugs, right? So that's where I started working as a community health worker. And this was before we had what we now call harm reduction, right? But we didn't even have those words then. This was in the late 80s. And so I worked for and ran a needle exchange site in San Francisco to decrease the spread of HIV and hepatitis B in the communities that were injecting drugs. And we did health education, and if someone was ready to think about sobriety or recovery, we had referrals. But that didn't actually happen all that often. And we were, there was some contentment knowing we were decreasing the spread of HIV and hepatitis B. And it was amazing when we first started, the needles would come and they were really short and stubby and super dirty. And as we did this over time, we saw them come back cleaner and cleaner, and seeing that people were actually doing single injection. And it was very satisfying. But at the same time, feeling like there was still an immense amount of suffering that I was witnessing in that role. And I did also some health education among youth experiencing significant adversity in foster care and this type of thing. And I had my first child at that time with a nurse midwife. And I said, oh, there's an empowerment aspect. And I thought about pregnancy and birth, and that year around there where people are more motivated to make change than probably any other time in their life, because it's like there's a new life coming. So that motivation is very high, and it can change the trajectory of not only the birthing person and their partner if they have one, but the trajectory of that child's life, the family's life. And so I felt it like a very ripe space to work around empowerment and being with women during this process. And so as I did that work, I realized that stress and toxic stress and trauma were blocks to transformation, even during that ripe time. And so I became very interested in that. And so that's maybe the last 10 plus years, that's where I've been working, is at that intersection of, stress, trauma, resilience and I love, as a midwife, I love working with birthing folks, especially pregnant and parenting teens is some of my dearest populations to work with. Because that's that point, they can motivate and change all kinds of things, and building resilience in that way. But um, I'm also very interested in working with lots of different kinds of people, because I find by working with different kinds of people in different contexts, you learn what's generalizable and what's specific.
Right.
I learn from one context to another in comparison, and there's just a lot of growth working at different scale and with different people. So working from individuals all the way up to policy, because I'm interested in, I mean, we don't exist in a cocoon, right? So you can do
Right.
recovery work with one person, but they're housing unstable, right? They're struggling with work. They're struggling with some of the really concrete things that an individual approach will not help, that you need to look at the system around them. And so I enjoy working at all those levels to further people's transformation. And Lumos does that. So that's sort of my heart brainchild.
Right.
Um, right.
Well, and it's interesting that with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris now, that with her position in California and her emphasis on childhood adverse experiences in childhood. So did you feel that's going to open some doors for some better policy?
I do. I see already. So they're looking at universal screening, which is,
Mm-hmm.
not looking at, they're like discussing how to do it, not like it's going to happen. How is it going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I do think that trauma is on the map,
Mm-hmm.
and people are paying attention in ways that they've never paid attention before. But that with all that opportunity, there are some dangers, because I see like everybody and their brother and sister
Right.
are calling themselves trauma experts
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
with minimal training. I
Right.
also see people it's all very well intentioned, right? It's all very well intentioned. They're like, oh, mindfulness, it's wonderful for trauma. And so we have people who've done like one class, and they're out there teaching it with people with high trauma loads. And so it's good that it's on people's minds. At the same time, like some respect for um, how to move through this path, is helpful
Right.
without hurting people, because even if your intention wasn't to do harm, there's some harm happening.
Yeah, I teach meditation, and what I found with meditation is that it's often not trauma informed, and that when you have someone with a lot of trauma, a fierce inner critic, a lot of catastrophic thinking, the last thing they should be doing is just silent meditation. Yeah.
Turning inwards. But the thing is we have to remember that meditation wasn't developed. It was developed it's a spiritual practice. It's not
Right.
developed to lower stress or treat trauma. That's not its goal. It's that
Yeah.
we've adopted it that way. And so we have to be very careful in that translation, how we do that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are the things that occupy my brain,
Mm-hmm.
and how I work in practice. And so with Lumos, um, we do a lot of trauma informed training for organizations and communities about how to do embodied trauma and resilience informed approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we do that for everybody from we just did police officers to um, doulas, midwives, doctors, nurses, mental health folks, teachers. So a lot, really broad, social service professionals working with people experiencing homelessness um, to just so pretty broad. Gang intervention is a big area we work, violence prevention.
Mm-hmm.
So how to look at becoming trauma informed from an embodied place. How do organizations or systems become trauma informed so that they're not re-traumatizing the people that they work with?
Right.
Right.
A lot of workplaces are really unsafe for the staff and the customers, the clients. Yeah.
Right. And so, if we think about addiction and we think about recovery, and, I think it's pretty well known that trauma underlays, especially relational trauma, underlays addiction. And so when people are struggling with addiction and then they're being re-traumatized in the places that they're going to get help,
Mm-hmm.
right? That should be foremost to our minds about
Right.
what are we doing about this to not re-traumatize people that are seeking help. And how do we
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge the reality of their traumas, and not just interpersonal in childhood and developmental, but what's happening on a cultural level, what's happening in the environment that they currently live in, not just childhood, and how are we acknowledging those realities? And then not
Mm-hmm.
over focusing on those realities to the detriment that we don't look at that person's strengths, that how did they get here? What resilience do they have and they bring? What are those strengths and how do we build on them? So these are I think what the trauma informed approach addresses is how do we hold people, um, if we're talking about in recovery, how do we hold people through recovery well in the systems of care and in the interpersonal? If people are seeking one-on-one care, how are the people that they're entrusting to be partners in that journey, how are they holding their trauma with them, and
Mm-hmm.
building resilience?
Right. So you mentioned some general principles that apply across the different groups of people that you work with. What are some of the things that you've learned from doing that?
That safety is probably the most important thing for
Mm-hmm.
everybody. For But people define safety differently, and so it's an important, I think, starting point conversation that needs to be had in all settings. What helps you feel safe?
Mm-hmm.
What helps you feel safe? And to explore that, um, I think it's so important. Um, it's such an important conversation about what helps me feel safe. What is safety? um, because it's very hard to embark on a healing journey or a transformation journey if you don't have any idea of where you can return and rest, where you can find safety when things get rough. And so I think that should
Mm-hmm.
be the starting point. The starting point for any journey is where's home. So it may be um, quite an exploration, right? That is in and of itself part of the healing. And what you find may be so small. Like I find this little teeny thing and it's not super safe, but it's relatively safer than everything else around it. That's a win. And how do we keep returning there over and over again so it strengthens, it deepens its roots, and it widens until it feels solid and it feels stable and it's something that I can hold on to and return to as I venture out, an anchor, so to say, right? As I venture out
Mm-hmm.
on this healing journey. And I think that across the board is the one thing that holds true with every group or organization or individual
Mm-hmm.
that I've ever worked with.
So are we talking about home in the body someplace? Is that where
Ideally,
people see?
ideally,
Ideally?
ideally, because your external environment can change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so whether it's, and for some people that people vision it differently. For some place, it's an imaginary spot with a lot of visuals inside of them. For some people, it's actually a physical location in the body. Um, there's different ways that people vision it, but it's a sense of like, I can return here and I can feel myself settle here. I know how to get here. Um,
Ah,
and it feels better here. And
mm-hmm.
again, I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do for some people who've
Right.
never known safety. That can be very difficult. And we have to acknowledge the realities of the places that people live and work. That may be very unsafe. Your community, your relationships may be unsafe. Um, but even just bringing this conversation forward um, helps people really think about. I was teaching last night a class in the community, and um, it was the second class in a series, and some folks were saying how they realized how upregulated, how activated their stress or trauma responses were, and a feeling of like I can settle it and then it comes right back up. I use the tools you taught me and I settle it and it comes right back up. And so my question was, so you're able to find that place, but, and they were kind of berating themselves, like, I can't maintain that. And the question was, I'm like, but what about the places you live and work? Are you actually responding appropriately to the places you live and work? And you're asking yourself to do something superhuman to be
Right.
calm and okay in a situation that's not calm and okay. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
remembering not always to pile it on the individual when we have to look at both. Right. And so um yes, it's ideal if the place, to your original question, is internal, because you have more control over that than you have over the external. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, and we think about somebody who's like extraordinary, like a Nelson Mandela, who said even within prison, he felt free within himself. And that's not,
Right.
like, that's something that's aspirational for most of us, right? But what's
Yeah.
possible? What's possible?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you do a lot of work with nonprofits as well as corporations. What's the difference that you're seeing between those, or are they quite a lot the same? I've done a lot of work with nonprofits, and there's a lot of stress in those places often.
Um, I mean, ultimately, both both nonprofit and, I mean, you have to remember, being nonprofit or for profit is just your corporate structure.
Right.
Right? It's just your corporate structure. It's really asking people what the organizational mission is. And you have some for-profits that have wonderful missions, and you have some nonprofits that have kind of recently we had a nonprofit here in Los Angeles that is folding, but they pay their CEO $400,000 a year. So I think it's a little bit of an artificial distinction between the two. Though
Mm-hmm.
there are different cultures, for sure. As Lumos, we're social enterprise, so we are technically for profit, but we chose that business model because it's lean and it allows us to pivot and be responsive to communities without, um, and we're accredited as such, so it's actually more accountability in some ways than a nonprofit. But what I
Mm-hmm.
see in terms of, there's huge amounts of stress in both. There's huge, I mean, in nonprofits, there's this sense that there's never enough
Right.
resources. And so there's a squeeze on people. There is a sense of, can be, where people are so devoted to the mission that they neglect themselves. Almost, I'm going to say, like, sometimes helping addiction, right? Like, that's another addiction, like where you're addicted to helping other people. And so when you ask, there's maybe a culture of this, a lot of burnout, or people are just really worn down from this constant giving. But when you say, okay, the cure for this is to look at the systems of care for the people providing the care, people go, whoa, I didn't sign up for that. I signed up to care for other people, because you're taking away the drug. You're taking away the drug of helping other people. It's a good drug in North American culture, but it's still a drug for some folks, right? It's a way to
Mm-hmm.
medicate our own suffering, is by helping others. So
Mm-hmm.
in for-profits, and in both of them, we see just a relentless push for productivity that sometimes just really outstrips human capacity. Um, and so people are tired and overworked and overstretched, and that we don't show up as our best selves. And I think this exacerbates, um, people's suffering. I mean, I think, like, stress is like throwing kerosene on people's suffering. And again, so if I think about people who are working recovery, about where their stressors might be coming from, like, working in a toxic workplace can be, you know,
Mm-hmm.
another,
Yeah.
another place of struggle. I mean, for anybody, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So what I find too is that with people with a fight response, for instance, they can be really difficult for other people to be around. And so that can create a lot of toxicity too. So how do you go in? Can you give us kind of a glimpse of what it would be like to go into an organization and work with them around trauma?
Well, there are those organizations that want to become trauma informed, which means they want to include trauma in how they operate, the understanding and knowledge of trauma, how they operate and avoid re-traumatizing the folks that they work with and their staff, right? But that's not trauma healing, right? There's no organization that I am aware of that is interested in trauma healing for their staff, because that's not, and I agree, it's not the place where you do trauma. You don't do trauma healing at work. It's not appropriate. Even a really flat organization, it's still generally, there's a little hierarchy and someone reports to someone else. With those power differentials, that's not where you do trauma healing. So I think that that's an important distinction, right? So generally, if we're in a workplace, we're helping folks identify that this is a salient issue for usually the people that you're serving and working with, and the staff or of the organization itself. And that if trauma healing is needed, that needs to happen for the staff outside of the workplace. So a big thing is giving people some frameworks to think about, right? What is trauma? What is stress? How does it show up? How is it showing up for you individually? How is it showing up for you on team dynamics, right? How is it showing up in the people you're tasked, your clients, your students, whoever it is that you're working with, so that there's an awareness that happens both internally and externally. And then there is a part where we'll keep it in the stress arena, right? Where it's not quite the stress management has its place in a workplace. That is okay. When it gets to the trauma level, people do need to take it outside, because there's another level of vulnerability that I just don't, again, think is appropriate when you're working with people. It's like a setup for some very weird boundaries, right? So managing, what does it look like to manage stress? And so that would be, how is it for you working with people individually to grow their capacity for self-awareness of their own? And that's where I bring in the Resilience Toolkit, which is growing your capacity to understand your own stress, trauma, and relaxation responses, appraise if they match the situation, and if they don't, how to settle them, choosing from a menu of quick, in real time tools, movement, mindfulness type tools, and how to develop the habits of doing that over time. And we find if individuals in organizations can take that responsibility and do that, with the organization providing resources of time, space for folks to do that work, that there's a natural increase in people's ability to work well together and be more settled, and provide better care, if it's a caregiving organization, to the folks that, that they're tasked to care for. But even if it's not a caregiving organization, it makes it a more pleasant place to work, where you're more creative, you're more connected, you're more, those human compassion values come in to play. And that's something that buoys everybody. It buoys everybody.
Right. And more productive too.
Yep. Right. And time for play and enjoyment, right? So it's not like, appropriately as it would be in a workspace. And that would be for any community or organization. It's very similar. And even in a family, doing family work, the same, right? Like how people can grow those skills, their own resilience skills, so that they can better be in connection with themselves and others.
Right. Could you give us an example, walk us through a few things that you would commonly do with people?
The first thing is the education. The most important thing is the framework, because there's lots and lots of practices out there. I think people tend to over-focus on the practices and under-focus on how you're approaching them. So I think one of the most important things in the way we work is talking about, how do you know something is working for you? Whatever practice you choose, How do you know it's working for you? So that's a self-exploration of your own, like, what does it feel like when I activate? What does it feel like when I calm and settle? So it's a collaborative process to answer that question. And over time, you become better at answering that question. So that's a big focus of the way we work. Another thing I was reminded of last night is we use a thing called off ramps or exit ramps. Like when you're practicing, if something doesn't feel um, comfortable, it feels like it's elevating your stress, then you stop, you take the exit. Don't feel like you have to do it to push through. That's not the point of the way that we approach building resilience. Um, and so people really appreciate that, because a lot of times they're like gritting their teeth, waiting to feel better in a practice. And really they need relief now in this moment. So I think about, we have a staff member in recovery who is actually developing to launch in January a toolkit for recovery, because she has found for herself, even though she has long-term sobriety, that the use of this perspective, this way of approaching, has allowed her to decrease her activation. So her cravings are way less. And if she has a craving, she can manage it through this method in a way. She's just much more settled than she ever has been, and has, a history of pretty significant relational trauma. So, and to me, that's very exciting to see how she's applied the approach for herself and with others in recovery, and then to make a formal like toolkit for recovery, which is still, it's the basic framework of Resilience Toolkit, but the examples and the focus of conversation is around recovery, just like we do when we do a special class for medical professionals or a special class for violence intervention professionals, that they're going to have special needs around what their particular challenges are, but the approach is applicable in all of them. So,
Right.
mhm.
So
Does
some
that
of the
answer your
foundation,
question? Did I answer your question?
yeah, you did, yeah. So some of the foundation, the education might be a little bit like tuned specifically to a certain group, but the basic tools would be very similar.
Right. And the framework is the same. Like but what happens, because it's collaborative, it's in that conversation. So it's, what are, it's going to be slightly different when you're working with the folks around a particular talk and you're working around recovery. They're going to have their own specific, they're going to be talking about cravings. They're going to be talking about, if they're new in sobriety, withdrawals. They're going to be talking about some different stuff than somebody who's doing violence intervention, about what is the particular landscape that they're navigating. So the landscape is different, but the approach is the same, in the sense of, how do I know when I'm settled? How do I know when I'm activated? When I'm activated and it's not helpful, it's not helping me in the situation, it's not adaptive, what can I do to settle myself that's life-giving and not harmful, like using? And in that way, how do I know that what I'm doing is life-giving? How do I evaluate it, right? Because sometimes in addiction, we'll see people swap out their substance or swap out the practice, the whatever it is. So you swap out sex for food, or you swap out, you can swap it out, but the attitude towards the substance or the activity is the same. And so that question of, how do I know that this is life-giving? How do I know that this is settling? How do I know this is helping? Is a really important question as you navigate that landscape of addiction and recovery, right? And and we really understand that there is, change is a process. It's not like wave a magic wand and sprinkle some fairy dust and ta-da, I'm resilient, I'm healed, I'm recovered. It's a process, and we're going to stand up and we're going to fall down, and we're going to stand up and we're going to fall down, and we're going to learn something in all of those processes. So built into the toolkit is, we talk about behavior change very explicitly, and what kind of supportive actions help wherever you are. How do we honor ambivalence in this process of building resilience? So I think that that's helpful, because I know that that's a big part of, of recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you work with shame? So many people have a lot of shame and core deficiency beliefs of I'm not worthy, I'm horrible. Do you address that specifically?
We don't, because while I do that myself in my private practice, but I engage different modalities. And at Lumos, we have basically a roster of different providers with different skill sets, from psychotherapists to massage therapists to hypnotherapists, that bring in other tools in addition to the resilience toolkit. So in their private work, they absolutely address shame.
Hmm.
In terms of the resilience toolkit, it doesn't address shame. And I think of the resilience toolkit as preparatory for change work. It's preparatory and runs alongside change and healing work, which means it teaches us, again, how to find some safety, how to find some stability, how to build our capacity to return to that place, to increase our distress tolerance. And when we have that increased distress tolerance, it's easier at that point to engage into the meat of the trauma healing, which is the narrative, which is the shame, which is this type of thing. But we're more prepared. We have more resources as we engage that conversation. So while the toolkit doesn't engage it directly, it prepares people for that conversation. And I find when we're highly stressed or traumatized, things tighten down, they become rigid. So our thought patterns become rigid and repetitive. And as
Right.
things settle and there's more safety, there's more spaciousness to think of other or entertain other possibilities, to entertain other ways of being, right? It opens up a bit, which makes it easier when you're doing direct shame work, right? Or addressing a trauma narrative directly. Does that help understand that
Hmm.
piece?
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. So, if a lot of our people that watch this summit are new to recovery or new to mindfulness, new to somatic work. So one thing that I find is oftentimes people say, I don't really know what goes on below my neck. It's all, I think about it and I'm tortured by these thoughts and I feel really stirred up. But do you have some examples or stories of people that you've kind of guided through that, from I'm just a mess to how to kind of get onto this healing path and become more resilient?
I think the first thing is when somebody says, like, I don't know what's going on below my chin. And I say, there's probably a very good reason for that. And I'm so glad that you could have your body had the wisdom to numb some things down for you to get through. So I think that part of that helps destigmatize and remove shame about the responses, just to say that's a superpower, right? To numb to that level. And
Yeah.
you didn't do it like, hey, I think I'm going to be numb today. Let me choose this for 10 years. Or there's a
Yeah.
reason for it. And it was adaptive for you at a time. The question to ask is, you're showing up now. It sounds like it might not be working still, right? It might not be adaptive for your exact moment. So about the conversation, really gently, can we start to drop in a little bit at a time, at a pace that feels comfortable for you and doesn't overwhelm you? And so in that instance, the dropping in um, would start with what's positive, not going to what's difficult, because it's numbed for a reason. So as we drop can we drop into something that's more positive? And that makes a safe place to start the embodiment, to start the landing. And so we have a practice we use called resourcing, which asks people to scan and find something that feels better than something else. And the act of comparison sometimes is settling, right? Because you're comparing one to another. Um, and it's like, oh, right? And there's sometimes people really can't feel anything, even with that. So we might start with some external cues, and starting to orient externally, right? But the gentle pacing, the assurance that we're not going to go faster than you can tolerate is so important. And
Mm-hmm.
that we have, and that orienting towards comfort, orienting towards ease, orienting towards safety first makes embodiment possible, right? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to throw you out like into the, into the thick of it without some good tools. We're going to, gear you up first. We're going to resource you first. And I think prefacing any healing work with that conversation is helpful. There was a woman in a course I taught a few months ago who said, like, when she would go to therapy, it was like just like opening this terrible door with all these monsters inside. And she's like, I don't want to do it. And I said, what would it be like if you could just keep that door closed and know that that door was staying closed? And you could visibly see her relax,
Mm-hmm.
visibly relax. And like, we are not going anywhere near that door. We're just going to work on how to be more comfortable with that door firmly closed, firmly closed. And she's like, well, I can do that. And she settled. And then I said, and if at any time you're curious, you could open that door when you're ready a little bit and then close it again. But we first have to make sure you can know how to be comfortable in this room with the door closed. And she's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I get it. And then there was a willingness, like, okay, let me give this a try. Like, um, there's a thing about just developmental appropriateness. We don't ask, a newborn baby to run a marathon. It's just not appropriate. They don't even know how to sit up. They don't know how to run. And so we're asking people who've had significant trauma and a lot of suffering and are doing the best they can with the coping skills that they have. And they're usually not all that healthy, but they're doing the best they can. And we throw them into the fire and we say, come on now, don't be resistant. Not okay. How do
Not
we
okay.
resource them first and calm first and slow this down and until they have trained up and now running a marathon? It's going to be hard, but you've been training and you're prepared, and that's a whole nother ball game. So that's how I think approaching this work around recovery can be different, because going into repeating our stories straight off the bat is often re-traumatizing. A trauma is a trauma because it overwhelmed us. And when we're like forced to repeat the story over and over again without any extra resources, we're just, digging in that trauma further. That trauma network is just becoming stronger and stronger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you talked about relational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
What would somebody be able to do if they have violence or a really critical person that they live with, or how do you help people work with that?
So ongoing and current relational trauma, and that could be in the workplace, an abusive boss. It could be a partner that's abusive. It could be a number of situations. It's a similar process of approaching, how do we resource this person? That person is in that situation, and usually if they're in that situation, they're probably all not ready to leave, and that conversation is usually just we're not ready for that. They're not ready for it. And it's not to force that conversation. It's about for them to, one, recognize, and this actually happened, what's today? Monday. So last week, where I was actually mentoring a trainee in our certification program, and the practice client that she was working with is in an abusive relationship and is having a lot of shutdown responses, to which she feels quite ashamed about the shutdown responses. And so a first part was normalizing those shutdown responses are what you have been doing to prevent further violence and abuse.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And it wasn't physical abuse, but definitely emotional, verbal abuse. So normalizing the responses as survival responses helps remove some of the shame around the risk or the responsibility for what I'm doing to protect myself. So that's really important and needs to happen over and over again. The skill to be able to recognize that often the person is carrying those same responses in all situations when the abuser is not actually there. So in a workplace situation where you have an abusive boss, client some time ago who had this particular situation, but then was going home and was still in the same state, when the boss was far away. And so for her, it was a process to recognize what was happening in her system, know when it was appropriate and protective, and say, good, I'm protecting myself. And then when it wasn't protective or wasn't needed, how could she let that go and settle? And as she did that, because when she originally came, she goes, I need to be able to handle this boss better. And I was like, whoa, like what's going on? And like really normalize, no, that you don't, you need, this situation isn't okay. And so as she practiced this buttoning up when she was around this abusive boss and settling when she wasn't, she started to feel stronger in herself because she had moments to recoup and connect to herself and her own power. And so what started to happen was she's like, I think I'm going to go to human resources and make a complaint. When before she was so buttoned up, she couldn't even reach out for help in the workplace.
Right.
She started talking to colleagues who also were experiencing the abuse. So she started to feel more resourced and strong. So when she was directly around this gentleman, she would do her response, right? But in all the other places, she was able to seek resources, to feel her strength and power until she was able to apply for a transfer and leave that position. And so, if I had, we had talked to her like, you should leave. She's not ready. She has ambivalence, right? There's ambivalence in her, and to honor that ambivalence and to help her resource herself, because as bad as it is, even if there's only 2 minutes a day that you're free of it, that 2 minutes, if you can settle, can help fortify you for the work to change. Because in that situation, it's not you that, you can't heal an abusive situation alone because there's an abuser. And so if the abuser isn't interested in treatment or isn't interested in changing, then at some point the healthy response is to leave, right? But people often are so beat down and so in their defense response that that's a very hard thing to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Some people might not have a lot of options either.
Yep.
If you have financial obligations and you don't have a lot of skill, or you don't have a lot of other options for jobs. Yeah. I know when I was a single parent, I had much less agency than I do now.
Absolutely. And so how is it, again, it's internal resources of strength, but also how even in this woman, in this workplace situation, she needed allies in the workplace. She needed human resources. She needed external resources that she didn't have, but she had to be in a place in herself that she could find and access them. And so that's what I see about growing resilience and changing in the moment things, because sometimes when people approach trauma healing, and there are a number of modalities that do this, they really consider trauma as something in the past, that the modality itself doesn't have as strong of a way to address ongoing trauma. And we know if we have a history of relational trauma when we're young, developmentally, we often choose relationships and workplace situations that are replications of those. So it's not uncommon that if we had it growing up, we have it in our current life as well in one way or another. And so I think it's important that the way we address these things isn't just visioning them in the past and healing from them. It's not like I had a car accident and now I'm like just healing the car accident. We're looking at things that are ongoing.
So how do you work with helping people be more on their own side, having compassion for themselves or kindness for themselves?
It's interesting. I think it's this feature of learning to know, like that question, how do you know something's helping you? And so it's such a compassion promoting question, because you start to look at the things around you and you go, is this helping me? Do I feel good doing this? Is this hurting me? And so there starts to be a more choice develops out of that question, I find, kind of naturally, where people, the awareness of, you know what? This isn't kind to myself. So that's more top of mind when you when you're working like in the Resilience Toolkit, for example, it's top of mind. And so people start to make some different choices. And I love last night in this class where this woman said, I did the practice, it didn't feel good, and I took the exit ramp. And that was revolutionary for me. It didn't feel good. I took the exit ramp. I've never done that before. That's
Mm,
self-compassion in action. And when it
right,
happens over and over again, it starts showing up in different ways. It doesn't even have, we don't even have to use the words. It just is self-compassion.
right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Hmm. So you work with, I notice you have partnerships with other organizations um, and the kind of work that you do, you've got people that you're training, people that are all over the world now. Can you talk a little bit about how people could get involved, maybe, to book your services or if they're interested in training, or how could people get involved?
So, the most of our offerings that we have directly to the public is the Resilience Toolkit. And so there are community classes both online and in person. Primarily we're based in Los Angeles, so we have monthly classes in Los Angeles, though we have a class Vancouver, New York, and developing some work in England right now, myself personally. We have and so being able to take and use the toolkit personally in like a class setting, again, online, small group, or in person or individually. I recommend going for the modality, the resilienceToolkit.co, not .com, .co. And that
Mhm.
has a listing of people who've been certified in the modality. Currently, we have about 50 folks certified, Canada and the US. Interestingly, in our certification program, most people, probably 75%, they are sponsored by their employer to be
Oh,
certified. So most people are not using this in private practice. They're using it in their schools. We have school districts, or in their university, in the counseling services, domestic violence shelters, etc. So people are using it in their community that sent them. So not listed in the provider database, but there is, so that's there, and the listing of classes worldwide. And then, see how that resonates for you. And if it resonates for you, um, getting certified, and it's a wonderful, I love to see how it's added. People use it in different ways. So to see our staff member who is in, recovery saying, this has been just taken my recovery to a whole nother level. And she now is um, doing that for groups for recovery specifically. So she's adapted it. How we've seen it be adapted to be used in prisons, how it's been adapted to be used in different settings. And I love to see the flexibility with which it can be used. And so we have once people are certified, we have an online community, a private online community where we share our ideas and what's going on and best practices. So that's it.
exciting.
To reach me personally, I'm on Twitter. So Nkem Ndefo, or Ndefo Nkem, I think is my Twitter handle. That's always
Okay.
nice for some direct connection. And I do have a small private practice that usually has a waiting list. I
Hmm.
use for myself, I use the Resilience Toolkit Emotional Transformation Therapy, which I'm trained in, and have some other trainings as well. So it's just, an eclectic mix, like most of us have um,
Right.
our what what works well for us and the folks that we see. So, and my
Hmm.
personal specialty is complex trauma, chronic illness.
Hmm.
So
Right.
usually the folks that see me have those. That's what's going
Have
on.
have something like that. Right. Yeah. So do you have any final parting words for people? Any kind of last minute things you'd like them to know?
Big thing: the trauma should be the worst part. The healing should not be worse. The healing
Mm,
should not be worse. And so engage on your healing path, your path of transformation. Pace it gently. Um, I know we want to feel better right away. And if
yeah.
there was a magic wand, we'd all be fine. this is a process. And so let's not make the process torturous. And so really focus on finding that place of stability, that place of safety, that oasis that can anchor you through your journey. When it gets bumpy, you've got a place to go lay your head and
Right.
people to do it with, you know.
And people to do it. Yeah. Hmm. Well, thank you so much, Nkem. It's been really interesting to hear you talk about your work, and I love talking with people who are passionate about what they do, because there's so many things ways we're finding to work really effectively, and it's just right out there. It's not pretentious. It's not rule driven. It's just like right here. Let's really do something that works.
There's enough suffering in the world, and it's critical. And I feel like trauma is a root cause of so much suffering. It's traumatized people traumatize other people. And so how do we break this cycle and release ourselves? And like so many like decisions that are made, you know, if we think about corporate decisions around the climate, that's coming from a traumatized place where you're thinking only short term, not long term. So many things, like, I think if we can settle down trauma, so many other things are symptoms of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, and it's great to have good colleagues on this journey, as we all, because there are many effective ways to do it. That's the one thing. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, with compassion and kindness all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center Radical Recovery Summit. We are so excited to bring you the lineup for January 10th to 19th, 2020. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to see the new headliners for 2020 and to sign up. You can watch free January 10th to 19th or buy an all-access pass.